Dakota Territory, March 1886. The blizzard came without warning on the night of March 14th, dropping temperatures from 32 degrees to 18 below zero in less than 4 hours. The wind arrived next, screaming across the prairie at 60 miles per hour, turning snowflakes into tiny knives that cut through walls and flesh with equal indifference. Joseph Ironhawk lost everything that night. His cabin, built the previous summer from cottonwood logs and prairie determination, collapsed under the weight of drifted snow at approximately 2 in the morning. The roof beam, weakened by a knot he hadn't noticed when selecting the timber, cracked first. Then the walls buckled inward, pushed by snow that had piled 8 feet high against the northern face. Joseph barely escaped with his wife, running deer, and their 2 children, Thomas, age 7, and little Mary, age 4. They scrambled through the splintering wood in their nightclothes, barefoot, with nothing but the quilts they'd been sleeping under. His 3 horses died where they stood in the lean-to stable, frozen solid before morning. His milk cow survived, only because she'd wandered to the lee side of the wreckage, where a pocket of relative shelter formed between the collapsed cabin and a snowdrift. His chickens, all 14 of them, were crushed when their coop folded like paper. The family spent the rest of the night huddled against the surviving cow, sharing her body heat, praying to every god Joseph had ever heard named, the Christian God the missionaries taught, the Lakota spirits his grandmother whispered about, and nameless forces he invented in his desperation. By dawn, Mary's toes had turned the waxy white of frostbite. Thomas couldn't stop shaking, his small body burning through calories faster than it could produce warmth. Running Deer's lips were blue, her breathing shallow, her eyes carrying the distant look of someone who has begun to surrender. Joseph felt nothing in his feet. He would later learn that he'd lost the smallest toe on his left foot, though he wouldn't notice it was gone until the spring thaw, when the blackened flesh finally separated from his body. Help came in the form of Samuel Bridger, a rancher who lived 4 miles east and who had somehow kept his buildings intact through the storm. Bridger found the Ironhawk family at mid-morning, guided by smoke from a small fire Joseph had managed to kindle using debris from his ruined home. The rancher loaded all 4 of them into his wagon, wrapped them in buffalo robes, and drove them to his homestead where his wife, Martha, spent the next 3 days fighting to keep Mary's feet attached to her legs. Mary survived. She kept her toes, but the damage was done. Invisible scars that would ache every winter for the rest of her life. A permanent reminder of the night the sky tried to kill her. The Ironhawks stayed with the Bridgers for 2 weeks, while Joseph assessed what remained of his homestead. The answer was almost nothing. The cabin was kindling. The stable was matchsticks. His winter stores, carefully preserved vegetables and salted meat that should have lasted until May, were scattered across a 1/4 mile of prairie, buried under snow, contaminated, ruined. His tools had survived, protected somewhat by the workshop corner of the collapsed cabin, but several had been damaged. His plow was intact. His seed grain, stored in a metal bin, was salvageable. He had land. He had seeds. He had enough tools to start over. But Joseph Ironhawk was done with starting over the same way. He stood on his property in early April, snow still patched across the ground, wind still carrying the memory of winter's teeth, and he looked at the hill. It rose perhaps 60 feet above the surrounding prairie, a geological anomaly in the flat landscape, the remnant of some ancient glacial deposit or erosion pattern that had left this one stubborn mound of earth standing while everything around it was scraped level. The hill faced south, its slope gentle enough to climb without difficulty, steep enough to shed water and snow. Previous owners of the land had ignored the hill. It was useless for farming, too steep for plowing, too rocky for easy construction. The surveyors had included it in Joseph's allotment as a kind of joke, unusable acres that padded the total without providing any actual value. Joseph's grandmother had told him stories about the old ways, about the earth lodges his ancestors built along the Missouri River before the reservations, before the treaties, before the world changed. Those lodges were dug into hillsides or riverbanks, their roofs covered with earth, their interiors warm in winter and cool in summer, regardless of what the weather did above. The whites built on top of the land, she'd said. We built inside it. That is why they are always cold and we are always warm. Joseph had dismissed these stories as nostalgia, the romanticized memories of an old woman who preferred the past to the present. Log cabins were what civilized people built. Earth lodges were primitive, the dwelling of savages who didn't know better. The blizzard had educated him. His civilized cabin had lasted 8 months. The hill had been standing for 10,000 years. He picked up his shovel and started digging. The work began on April 12, 1886, as soon as the ground thawed enough to accept a blade. Joseph chose a spot on the southern face of the hill, about 20 feet above the base, where the slope was steep enough to provide good drainage, but gentle enough to allow construction. He cut into the hillside horizontally, removing soil and rock in wheelbarrow loads that he dumped on the slope below. The work was brutal, the kind of labor that broke men's backs and spirits. But Joseph had a motivation that transcended physical pain. Every time his shoulders burned, he remembered Mary's white toes. Every time his hands blistered, he remembered Running Deer's blue lips. Every time his back threatened to give out, he remembered the sound of his cabin collapsing, the crack of the roof beam, the scream of the wind that had almost taken everything he loved. Never again, he whispered to himself. Never again. By the end of April, he had excavated a space roughly 15 feet deep into the hillside, 12 feet wide, and 7 feet tall. The soil was dense clay mixed with gravel, stable enough to hold its shape without immediate shoring, but he added support anyway. Vertical posts every 4 feet along the walls, horizontal beams across the ceiling, everything notched and fitted with the precision his father had taught him. The neighbors noticed, of course. Word traveled fast on the prairie, carried by curiosity and boredom and the fundamental human need to know what everyone else was doing. Samuel Bridger rode over in early May, the same man who'd saved Joseph's family from the blizzard. He sat on his horse and watched Joseph emerge from the hole in the hillside, covered in dirt, exhausted but determined. "What are you building, Joseph?" "A home. In the hill. Inside the hill, where the wind cannot reach, where the cold cannot find my children." Bridger was quiet for a moment. He was a decent man, one of the few in the territory who treated Joseph as something other than an inconvenient Indian. But even decent men had limits to their understanding. "You're digging yourself a grave," Bridger finally said. "The hill will collapse on your family while they sleep. You'll kill them yourself instead of letting the weather do it. The weather already tried. I'm making sure it doesn't get another chance. Joseph, I've lived on this prairie for 11 years. I've seen every kind of shelter men can build. I've never seen anyone live in a hole in a hill. Your people have been here 11 years. My people were here for 1,000. We lived through winters that would have killed your grandparents. We knew things your grandparents never learned." Bridger shook his head slowly. "I hope you know what you're doing. I truly do. I don't want to dig your family out of a collapsed tunnel come fall. You won't have to dig anyone out. Come back in January. See how we're living then." The rancher rode away, unconvinced. Joseph returned to his digging. Word spread through the settlement within days. The Indian who'd lost his cabin was now digging a cave. The Indian thought he could live underground, like a badger or a prairie dog. The Indian was going to bury his family alive with his primitive foolishness. The reactions ranged from pity to contempt. "He's lost his mind," declared Thomas Henshaw, a farmer who'd arrived from Ohio 3 years earlier and considered himself an expert on all things practical. "The grief has driven him mad. First, the blizzard destroys everything. Now he's digging his own tomb." "Indians never did understand proper construction," agreed William Porter, the land office clerk. "They lived in tents and mud huts for centuries. You can't expect them to suddenly grasp civilized building methods." "Someone should stop him," suggested Martha Bridger, who had nursed little Mary back from the edge of frostbite. "For the children's sake, if nothing else. Those poor little ones have suffered enough without their father burying them alive." The women of the settlement organized an intervention. 3 wives rode to the Iron Hawk homestead on a Saturday afternoon in late May, finding running deer cooking over an outdoor fire while her husband continued his excavation. "Mrs. Ironhawk," began Elizabeth Henshaw, wife of Thomas, "we're concerned about your family's welfare. Your husband seems to be building something unusual." Running Deer looked at the 3 white women with the patient expression of someone who had learned that argument was pointless. "He's building a home. In a hill, dear. He's digging into a hill. That's not how civilized people live. Civilized people froze to death last winter. 3 families in this territory alone. We will not be the 4th. But surely a proper cabin. Our proper cabin collapsed. Our proper cabin nearly killed our daughter. Our proper cabin was a death trap dressed up as shelter." Running Deer's voice remained calm, but her eyes had hardened. "My husband knows what he's building. His grandmother's people survived winters that would have turned your bones to ice. I trust his knowledge more than your comfort." The wives retreated, offended by the comparison, certain that tragedy was inevitable. Joseph continued digging. By June, the main chamber was complete. 20 feet deep, 14 feet wide, 8 feet tall at the center with a gently arched ceiling that distributed weight evenly across the supporting beams. The floor was leveled and covered with a layer of gravel for drainage, then flat stones fitted together like puzzle pieces, then packed clay mixed with straw. The walls were lined with split logs, creating an inner shell that held the earth at bay, while providing a surface that could be whitewashed for light reflection. Between the logs and the earth, Joseph packed a mixture of dried grass and clay, creating an insulating layer that would moderate temperature fluctuations. The entrance was a tunnel rather than a simple door. 8 feet long, angled slightly downward from outside to inside, with a sharp right-angle turn halfway through. The design served multiple purposes. The length provided additional insulation. The downward angle ensured that cold air, which was heavier than warm air, would flow out rather than in. The right-angle turn blocked direct wind penetration regardless of storm direction. At the end of the entrance tunnel, Joseph hung 2 doors. A heavy outer door of thick planks to block the worst weather, and a lighter inner door of canvas stretched over a wooden frame to create an airlock. Between the 2 doors, a small chamber served as a mudroom where wet clothing could be removed before entering the main living space. The ceiling received special attention. Joseph knew that the greatest danger in an underground structure was collapse, and he was determined to make his ceiling strong enough to survive anything the prairie could throw at it. The main beams were cottonwood logs 8 inches in diameter, spanning the width of the chamber with their ends buried deep in the earthen walls. Across these beams, he laid smaller poles in a tight grid, then branches, then a thick layer of willow mats, then clay, then sod. The finished roof was 3 feet thick, a massive weight of earth and vegetation that would have crushed a conventional ceiling but was fully supported by the arch design and the heavy beams beneath. The weight was actually an advantage. It compressed the structure, making it more stable, and provided thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it at night. On the southern face of the hill, above the entrance tunnel, Joseph installed windows. 2 of them, each 2 feet by 3 feet, glazed with glass he'd purchased from the territorial supply at a cost that consumed most of his remaining savings. The windows were angled to catch maximum winter sun when the light came in low from the south, while the overhanging earth above shaded them from the high summer sun. The neighbors watched the windows go in with renewed criticism. "Glass in a dirt hole," laughed Thomas Henshaw. "He's putting windows in a grave. What's next? Curtains for a coffin?" But the windows transformed the interior. Sunlight flooded through on clear days, reflecting off the whitewashed walls, filling the space with warmth and cheer that no one had expected from a hole in a hill. The effect was so dramatic that even Running Deer, who had supported her husband's vision throughout, was startled by the result. "It's bright," she said, standing in the center of the main chamber on the first sunny day after the windows were installed. "It's actually bright in here." "The earth is our shelter," Joseph said. "The sun is our guest. Both can live together." The summer passed in continued construction. Joseph added a second chamber behind the main living space, smaller, designed for food storage. The back room stayed cooler than the front, naturally refrigerated by its distance from the windows and the thermal mass of the earth surrounding it. Vegetables stored there in autumn would last through the winter, without freezing or rotting. He added a third chamber, smaller still, connected to the main room by a low passage. This would house their 2 goats and dozen chickens through the winter months. The animals would generate heat that would flow into the living space, while their waste could be collected and composted for the garden. The ventilation system was the final innovation. Joseph cut a shaft through the hill from the back storage room to the surface above, lining it with stones to prevent collapse. A second shaft rose from the animal chamber. The 2 shafts, combined with the entrance tunnel, created a circulation pattern that brought fresh air in through the entrance, drew it through the living spaces, and exhausted stale air through the shafts. By September 1886, the Ironhawk family moved into their new home. The space was comfortable beyond anything Joseph had imagined. The main chamber held their beds, their table, their stove, their lives. The whitewashed walls reflected lamplight into every corner. The stone floor, covered with woven rugs Running Deer had made from scrap fabric, was solid and dry and somehow welcoming. The ceiling arched overhead like the inside of a great beast's ribcage, protective and strong, and it was warm. Even before winter arrived, the difference was noticeable. The earth surrounding the chamber maintained a temperature of approximately 52 degrees, regardless of external conditions. In September, when nights grew cold enough to frost, the underground home stayed comfortable without any fire at all. The children slept with single blankets instead of the piled quilts they'd needed in the cabin. "How warm will it stay in winter?" Running Deer asked. "With the stove and the animals and the sun through the windows, 60 degrees, maybe warmer on sunny days. 60 degrees in January. The earth doesn't know what month it is. The earth only knows its own temperature. We're living inside the earth now. We share its warmth. The first test came in November. An early winter storm dropped 18 inches of snow and temperatures to 15 below zero. The settlers battened down, fired their stoves to maximum, and prepared for the familiar misery of frontier cold. At the Ironhawk homestead, the storm was barely noticeable. Joseph recorded temperatures in a notebook he'd begun keeping for exactly this purpose. Outside temperature, -15. Inside, temperature, 58. The stove burned at low heat, consuming perhaps a quarter of the fuel a conventional cabin would require. The windows, though covered with snow on the outside, still admitted diffuse light. The children played on the stone floor in bare feet. "How is that possible?" Running Deer asked, watching Thomas and Mary chase each other around the main chamber. "It's 15 below outside." "The earth is our blanket," Joseph said. 3 feet of dirt and sod above us, 8 feet of hillside around us. The cold cannot reach us. The cold doesn't even know we're here. Word began to filter back to the settlement. The Indian family in the hill had survived the November storm without difficulty. The children were reportedly healthy. The home was reportedly warm. The whole arrangement was reportedly not the disaster everyone had predicted. Samuel Bridger rode over in late November, driven by curiosity and perhaps a bit of guilt over his earlier skepticism. He tied his horse outside the entrance tunnel and called out a greeting. "Come in," Joseph's voice echoed from inside. "Duck your head in the tunnel. It opens up inside." Bridger crawled through the entrance, made the right-angle turn, pushed through the canvas inner door, and emerged into the main chamber. He stopped, unable to process what he was seeing. The space was warm, not just not cold, but genuinely, comfortably warm. The temperature felt like late spring, not early winter. Sunlight streamed through the south-facing windows, filling the room with golden light. The children sat at a table doing lessons, barefoot, dressed in simple cotton clothing that would have meant death in a conventional cabin at this time of year. "My God," Bridger whispered, "it's like summer in here." 59 degrees this morning, Joseph said. "It will reach 62 by afternoon when the sun warms the windows fully. Tonight, it will drop to perhaps 56. It never changes more than that." Bridger walked slowly around the chamber, touching the whitewashed walls, looking up at the solid ceiling, feeling the warmth rising from the stone floor. The floor is warm. The earth below us never freezes. It stays the same temperature year-round. We're sitting on top of natural heat, but your stove is barely burning. I can see it. You're using almost no fuel. We don't need fuel. The earth heats us. The sun heats us. The animals heat us. Joseph gestured toward the passage leading to the animal chamber. 2 goats and 12 chickens add maybe 5 degrees. It's not much, but it's enough. Bridger sat down heavily on a wooden bench, trying to reconcile his predictions with the reality before him. "I told you that you were digging a grave. You did. I told you the hill would collapse on your family. You did. I was wrong." The words came hard, the way admissions of error always came hard for men who considered themselves practical and experienced. "I was completely wrong. This is remarkable. This is old," Joseph corrected. "This is how my grandmother's people lived. This is how my great-grandmother's people lived. This is how my ancestors survived winters that would have killed every settler in this territory. It's not remarkable. It's just forgotten." Bridger visited 3 more times before Christmas, each time bringing another neighbor to see the miracle in the hill. Thomas Henshaw came, the same man who'd joked about curtains for a coffin and left without any jokes at all. William Porter came, the land office clerk who'd dismissed Indian construction methods as primitive. and spent an hour asking questions about thermal mass and insulation values. The women came too. Elizabeth Henshaw, who had organized the intervention to save the children from their father's foolishness, stood in the middle of the main chamber with tears in her eyes. "It's beautiful," she said. "I expected a cave. A dark, damp, miserable cave. This is a home. This is a real home." "It's a better home than the cabin that collapsed," Running Deer said, without any trace of bitterness. "It's a better home than we ever imagined we could have." January 1887 brought the true test. The winter of 1886 to 87 would later be called the worst in the history of the Great Plains, a season of storms so severe that they killed millions of cattle and reshaped the entire ranching industry of the American West. Blizzard followed blizzard, each one worse than the last, with temperatures that stayed below zero for weeks at a time and snowdrifts that buried buildings to their rooftops. The storm that struck on January 9th was merely the first in a series, but it was bad enough. Temperatures plunged to 38 below zero. Wind drove snow horizontally at speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to zero. The world became a howling white void where direction and distance lost all meaning. At the Henshaw homestead, the cabin held together, but the family nearly didn't. Their stove consumed firewood at a terrifying rate, and by the second day of the storm, Thomas was burning furniture. His wife huddled with their 3 children in one corner of the cabin, wrapped in every blanket they owned, watching their belongings disappear into the flames. At the Porter homestead, disaster struck at midnight on the second night. A window shattered under the pressure of drifted snow, and before William could board it over, the temperature inside dropped below freezing. His youngest daughter, age 6, developed frostbite on her fingers that would leave permanent scars. At the Bridger homestead, the roof began to groan under the weight of accumulated snow. Samuel spent 6 hours on January 10th shoveling the roof, while the wind tried to knock him into oblivion, knowing that if he stopped, his home would collapse like Joseph's cabin had collapsed the year before. At the Iron Hawk homestead, the family ate dinner. The entrance tunnel had drifted over with snow, but this was expected and even welcome. The snow provided additional insulation, sealing the entrance more thoroughly than any door could. Joseph had dug a small ventilation shaft to the surface, disguised and protected by a wooden cover, which he cleared each morning with a long pole. Air flowed in. The family breathed. The storm raged impotently above. The temperature in the main chamber never dropped below 54 degrees. The children played. Running Deer cooked. Joseph read from the Bible that the missionaries had given him, finding unexpected comfort in the story of Noah, another man who had built a shelter while his neighbors laughed, another man who had survived while the world drowned around him. The storm lasted 3 days. On the morning of January 12th, Joseph dug out through the entrance tunnel and emerged into a transformed world. The snow was drifted 15 feet high in places, sculpted into alien shapes by wind that had erased every familiar landmark. The silence was absolute, the kind of silence that only comes when everything that might make noise has been killed or buried. He made his way to the Bridger homestead first, breaking trail through snow that reached his chest. He found Samuel on his roof again, clearing snow that had accumulated even after the storm ended, his face gray with exhaustion. "You survived," Bridger said, his voice hoarse. "We had dinner. The children played games. We slept warm every night." "Dinner." Bridger laughed, a hollow sound. "I burned my wife's rocking chair. Her grandmother made that chair, brought it across the ocean from Norway. I burned it to keep my children alive. Come to the hill tonight, all of you. There's room." "Joseph, come, rest, get warm, then we'll check on the others." The Bridgers came. So did the Henshaws, whose cabin had survived but whose firewood had not. So did the Porters, whose daughter needed warmth and care that their damaged cabin could no longer provide. By nightfall, on January 12th, 14 people were sheltered in the underground home that everyone had called a grave. The space that had seemed spacious for 4 became crowded with 14, but it was warm crowding. Body heat from the additional people actually raised the temperature to 65 degrees, the warmest the chamber had ever been. The children slept in piles like puppies. The adults took shifts, some sleeping while others sat watch, though there was nothing to watch for except the miracle of warmth in a world that had turned to ice. They stayed for 3 days, until the weather moderated enough for travel and repair. During those 3 days, Joseph explained everything: the thermal mass, the earth insulation, the south-facing windows, the animal heat integration, the ventilation system. He drew diagrams in the dirt floor and answered questions until his voice gave out. "You knew this would work," Samuel Bridger said on the second night, his children sleeping peacefully in a corner, his wife finally relaxed after days of terror. "You knew it would work, and we laughed at you. I knew because my grandmother knew, because her grandmother knew, because our people survived here for 1,000 years before your people came. We called it a grave. We said you were burying your family. You were wrong. We were arrogant." Bridger stared at the ceiling, the solid earth that had protected them all. "We thought we knew better. We thought our cabins and our methods were superior because they were ours. We never considered that someone else might have learned things we hadn't." The aftermath of the January storms reshaped the settlement. Thomas Henshaw began digging into the south-facing hill on his property before the snow fully melted. His wife, Elizabeth, who had once organized interventions against Joseph's foolishness, now organized work parties to help with the excavation. The Porters built a hybrid structure, a conventional cabin with an earth-bermed north wall and a root cellar expanded into a full emergency shelter. It wasn't as elegant as Joseph's design, but it incorporated the principles he'd taught. Samuel Bridger went further. He purchased the land adjacent to his homestead specifically because it contained a suitable hillside, and he spent the summer of 1887 building a full earth-sheltered home according to Joseph's specifications. The Bridger dugout, as it came to be known, would house 3 generations of the family over the next 60 years. By the following winter, 5 families in the settlement had some form of earth-sheltered construction. By 1890, the technique had spread throughout the territory, adapted and modified for different conditions, but always based on the principles Joseph Ironhawk had remembered from his grandmother's stories. The winter of 1887 to 88 was nearly as severe as the one before. But this time, no one in the settlement lost fingers or toes. No one burned their furniture. No one's children developed frostbite inside their own homes. Joseph Ironhawk lived in his hillside home for another 41 years until his death in 1928 at the age of 73. Running Deer passed 2 years before him, surrounded by children and grandchildren in the chamber they had carved together. Thomas and Mary raised their own families in earth-sheltered homes, carrying forward the knowledge their father had recovered from the edge of extinction. The original structure still exists, maintained by the County Historical Society as an example of indigenous-inspired architecture. Visitors can walk through the entrance tunnel, duck through the canvas inner door, and stand in the main chamber where 14 people survived the worst winter in Great Plains history. The temperature inside is 53 degrees, regardless of the season. The guides tell the story of Joseph Iron Hawk, the man who lost everything to a blizzard and built something the blizzard couldn't touch. They explain the physics of thermal mass and passive solar heating. They demonstrate how the ventilation system works, how the animal chamber connects, how the storage room stays cool enough to preserve food year-round. But the part of the story that resonates most isn't about physics or engineering. It's about a man who remembered what his grandmother knew when everyone else had forgotten. A man who dug into a hill while his neighbors called it a grave. A man who offered shelter to the same people who had laughed at his methods and predicted his failure. They called it a grave because they couldn't imagine living inside the earth. They laughed because they couldn't believe that an Indian might know something they didn't. They needed it because winter doesn't care about pride or prejudice or the assumptions of civilized men. The hill is still there. The shelter is still there. The warmth is still there, rising from the earth that Joseph Iron Hawk trusted when no one else would. All you have to do is dig deep enough to find it.